and the Weston Mill, which still stands, retaining its function and character from another era.
The mill was extremely important to a town, and this town in particular. You couldn't go to Manchester to buy things like you can today. You had to make them, and if you didn't make them, you had to do without them. And this is the waterfall that Ezekiel Pease built in 1780. And this is the Inlet Gate, the gate that allows some of the water to come into the under part of the water pit. And it has two mechanisms to raise and lower slides, which uncover holes, and when the hole is uncovered, the water goes in. We are now on the other side of the Inlet Gate, and you can clearly see the two pipes that we have coming into the Inlet Gate that go to various places. When the mill was first built, they only had the waterfall, the water wheel, at the place where it is now situated, and the sawmill. And this was only a sawmill until 1900, when there was a big fire here, and the water wheel burnt up and part of the building also, and the decision was made to go to turbines instead of water wheel for the prime mover. The big turbine, the 75 horsepower rated turbine, was hooked up to drive the grist mill. That's a runner stone. It weighs 2,000 pounds. And it has grooves on the underside of it. It sits on top of a bedstone, which is built into the floor, which doesn't rotate, but it has also grooves in it, so that when the two grooves come together, they cut the grain like a pair of scissors and send the pieces of cut grain outward to the outside of this container. We, of course, have the hopper, and you pour the grain in, and it goes in between these two stones. There is another pulley underneath the main driving pulley that is attached to this pulley. And it turns this shaft, and it turns this gear, and it turns this gear, which is attached to a bucket, a chain of buckets, where the grain is, the flour now is shooting out. It fills the buckets, and this gear is pulling on the belt and turns it over and inverts the belt so that the flour goes into this sifter. In the meantime, this belt is attached to a shaft which has an eccentric. When this goes around in a circle, this peg goes straight back and forth. The sifter is tilted down, and the hard particles go down to one compartment, and the rest of the flour goes into this bin here, put into a can, and then we bag it. Kernel corn, semp, wheat, rye, all kinds of grains we have ground here. This mill, I am told by SPOOM, which is the Society for the Preservation of Old Mills, will be the only working hydro-powered grist mill in the state of Vermont.
While the West River served its purpose in sustaining communities, its role in transportation was limited. However, its banks would prove useful as the pathway for a new form of conveyance to and from the valley.
Railroad fever actually hit the valley in the 1850s, but unfortunately the Civil War came along, which stopped everything pretty much in its tracks until the end of the Civil War. In the 1870s, again, it was time to revisit the idea of building a railroad up through the valley, and at that time, the towns were polled and they decided to go ahead and construct the West River Railroad, with each town bonding for a specific amount so that they could have a station in the railroad go through their right-of-way. The original design was to build the railroad from Brattleboro to Whitehall, New York, but they didn't have enough money to do that, so the final bonding was to build a railroad from Brattleboro to the village of South Londonderry. Construction was started in the late 1870s, and the railroad was actually finished in the fall of 1879, I believe is the correct date. But since it was the fall and they hadn't finished everything, the first trains really didn't run till 1880. Merchants wanted it because they had a way to get their wares in and out of the valley, but a lot of the residents were really not so sure that they really wanted to spend their money bonding a railroad that, the economic viability was never really proven at that point. Initially, they wanted to build a 3-foot gauge railway, and then they decided that maybe a 2-foot gauge was better. And then they went out west and looked at the railroads being built in Colorado and finally decided that a 3-foot gauge railway was really the appropriate thing that they wanted to build. A 3-foot gauge railroad is an easier railroad to construct, however, because you don't have to clear as many trees, do as much blasting, but then you have the interchange problem where you're interchanging with another railroad that was standard gauge, so there's a labor cost involved where you have to move merchandise between cars, back and forth. And when they built the granite quarry in Dummerston, that became a big problem because now you had to unload large blocks of granite between different railroad cars to get shipped to the points out west where the granite was going. Well, the Chicago Board of Trade building was actually built of Dummerston granite, and you can imagine the number of carloads of granite that were being shipped to build this massive building. And eventually, the thing that drove the standard gauging of the railroad was actually the requirements of the granite quarry in Dummerston, is that they needed to be able to ship the granite on standard gauge cars. So in the early 1900s, they standard gauged or dual gauged the line from Brattleboro to the quarry so that they didn't have to transship the granite. And in 1905, that all changed when they decided that it was time to standard gauge the entire line, and they did that in 1905. The railroad of the 1880s and the early 1900s was to the Valley residents what Route 30 is today. The railroad really was the major connector of commerce between people in the valley and the outside world, including Boston, New York, even Springfield, Massachusetts, Hartford, Connecticut, and points to the south. Anything that you can think went on the railroad. There was very little that went on the roads at the time, because the roads at the time were basically just for people to, get along in their horse and buggy, and then when the Model Ts came along. But if it was big and it had to be shipped, it was shipped on the railroad. Even small lots were shipped on the railroad. So this was an outlet for the products, and they had a way to get the stuff to market and get stuff from the cities into the villages. Well, as you know, the first week of November in 1927 were the time when the great rains hit the valleys. And essentially the West River was knocked out of service from the Salmon Hole Bridge north to South Londonderry, with the Salmon Hole Bridge being taken out and the railroad essentially washed away further up north. At that point, the Central Vermont Railroad itself had been in a period of decline. It had been in receivership, and they were trying to get rid of their branches as fast as they could. And the 27 flood was a perfect time for them to go ahead and do it. So after the 27 flood, the Central Vermont petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission to abandon the West River branch. And after much discussion in Washington, they were allowed to do that. Between the period of 1927 until the railroad was rebuilt in 1931, the country went through the Great Depression. So in 1929, business in the valley had essentially dried up to the point that it had been prior to the early 1900s. A lot of the industries had moved or gone out of business. So when the railroad came back into operation in 1931, there really wasn't a lot left that was relying on the railroad to ship their merchandise anymore. Anything that had been shipped had moved over to trucks or had essentially gone out of business. The final towel, I believe, was thrown in 1936, and the railroad was scrapped that year. They started from South Londonderry and worked down to Williamsville, taking up the track. I believe by 1939 the tracks were essentially all gone. In Victor Morse's book, 36 Miles of Trouble, one of the things that he tends to highlight is the accidents that happen along the railroad. But you have to remember, in the early industrial age, accidents were quite commonplace, and the railroads were no exception. And the West River Railroad really, other than the great wreck at Three Bridges that killed J.J. Green, there really wasn't anything else spectacular that really happened along the railroad. You had your weekly derailments, and you had your washouts, and you had your engines overturning, but that wasn't anything that wasn't uncommon to any other railroad of the area. Victor Morse's book tends to lead the premise that the railroad was really a failure and there was no reason for building the railroad, where if you look at the over 50 years of history of the railroad, you realize that for the first 40 really years, it was successful in what it was attempting to do and to provide transportation and a method of commerce through the valley. So in that aspect, it really was successful in what it was trying to do. For its time, before the era of the automobile, I mean, it was how you got up and down the valley. Later on, yeah, its time passed, and it was time to say goodbye to the railroad.
Though the tracks no longer remain, the pathway still does. Today, 16 miles along the old passage make up the West River Trail and are available to hikers, walkers, skiers, and bikers. Organized in 1992, Friends of the West River Trail is dedicated to the establishment of a 36-mile scenic trail through the West River Valley, eventually linking Brattleboro, Dummerston, Newfane, Townsend, Jamaica, and South Londonderry. Unlike the railroad, which was adversely affected by the great floods of 27 and 38, the next large-scale construction effort in the valley was in fact a specific result of them. When completed, two projects would render landscapes such as these in Townsend to the realm of scrapbooks and memories, and in so doing, profoundly changed the character of the river. It's hard for valley newcomers to imagine the landscape without the Ball Mountain and Townsend Dams. Designed by the Army Corps of Engineers and built in large part by many local valley residents, these impressive achievements testify to the awesome flooding potential of the West River.
The reason that these two dams were built was to help with flood control in the Connecticut River, especially down by Massachusetts and Connecticut. Instead of putting three very large dams on the Connecticut, they put several dams up the feeders. So that's why you have two dams up the West River. The dams were built in the late 50s and started in operation in 1960 and 1961. And prior to that, 38 through the 40s, there was hurricanes and there was a lot of flooding. And so that was one of the things where Congress started looking at them and said, geez, we got to do something about this, and started trying to control nature. Most all of the core dams are rolled earth or packed earth dams with a center that was made out of like clay that's impervious, and then rock on the outside so it wouldn't wash away. Ball Mountain is actually the tallest earthen dam in New England. The Townsend Dam isn't as high as Ball Mountain. It has cable gates, 3 cable gates. So they have these great big spools of cable and these motors that will pick the gate up and let the gate down. It also has a horseshoe weir on the middle gate. What that does is it just creates a 21-foot conservation pool so that whatever comes in goes right out.